So guys, hey John, my idea for today wasn't really to do like a presentation, though I can present again bits and pieces from what I did last time, but I just wanted to discuss some of the ideas to make sure what you guys, to give more time also to get feedback and to see what you guys think and where we could take them, because in a certain way this whole thing is on the one side a development from something that Moscardi and I worked for on the Atlas, was I think the only thing we published thus far that related to, okay, well, how does nature, ecology and so on feature into the stuff we're doing. But as I was trying to develop it, I also saw that it serves as the connecting point to other interesting things that were kind of in the air that we could work on. And I mean, I just felt like it was better to make sure like the basic stuff I was trying to develop makes sense and that we can discuss it, rather than moving very quickly over a bunch of topics and to a second presentation and so on. I think I mentioned this at the beginning of last time, but my idea was to divide this thing I'm talking about, that I'm trying to unify under the idea of environment logic or something like this, under three things that I think are connected in a strange way. The first is more obvious, which is environment as it relates to nature. So how is nature part of social world, right? So that would be the first issue, which is what I tried to present last time. But then the same idea of environment connects with something else, because I think that the key contribution of a recent book that made some stir in the value form theory community is a really interesting book that mixed value theory and more political Marxism, which was called Mute Compulsion by a guy called Soren Mao. I think I lended it to you, right, Fernando? Just to know what it is. And
yes, it's
yeah, one of the key ideas that he presents, which I think is very fitting to things that we work on and that makes some of the ideas of value theory a bit more tractable, is that capitalist power is enacted through the environment. So the idea that it's not, of course there is ideology, of course there is violence, but there is also a secret third thing, which is not so much how your model of the world is changed ideologically, not so much direct coercion. If you don't do this, you get beaten up, killed, go to jail or whatever. But there is a way in which objective worlds are shaped so that you take some path rather than another. So you're, let's say, nobody's going to put you in jail if you don't sell your labor. But if you don't sell your labor, you die. So how do you name that? If you don't do this, you die. But it's not because it's natural that you die. It's social that you die. So how do you name that? And Mao tried to approach it from this angle. Well, this is an environment constraint, right? So the first idea of environment concerns nature and social worlds, but it also helps us to discuss environment as an inherently social idea. In which sense, what is an environment? Because an environment is not just a world. It's like a niche in the world. It's like the part of the world it's objective. You have access to, you interact with. It's outside of a certain organization, outside of a system. So it felt like a second topic. That's what I plan to develop next time. But I didn't want to go into that before discussing environment and its connection to nature, which is where the discussion is already a bit more developed. And then there is a third idea, and this is not coming from the outside, from Soren Mao's work or from the current debate on ecology. It's coming from something that we hinted at once. We ended up writing about it in the text, in the conclusion of that Working Through Political Organization text, but we never developed it in detail. And I do think it's a very powerful idea, which is the idea that there is something about socialist or communist transition or revolution that the best way to think about it is when a system or a set of systems that is embedded in an environment becomes large enough that it becomes the environment for what was previously its environment. So you have like a small cooperative and a capitalist world around it. Like it's an island in a capitalist sea. Well, if that island is glued with other islands and with enough other islands, the sea becomes a lake and the environment becomes the land around it, right? So it's a strange idea of social transformation, where it's not really a classic model of transition, where it's a matter of time, right? And it's not exactly a matter of space, because we can have very few capitalist enterprises, as we do, very few monopolies, but they still rule the world, even if most things are not capitalist. Like most things are not capitalist in the world, like other types of groupings and social connections and so on. So that shift between environment and system seemed like a nice idea to develop. So just one second. Guys, I just need to pick up the mail. 1 second, I'll be right back. One minute. All right, guys. Yeah, so I was saying, the idea is that the concept of environment should apply to these three things, right? Should apply to, oh my God, to these three things. And my idea is, of course, first to start with the discussion about nature, but then to try to keep some sense of environment that applies to these other contexts as well. So nature, social, and something more political, right? So that's why don't plan to go into all of that today. I can't even. I need to study more, but that's kind of the gist of the whole thing. Yeah, I'm not sure if I should go over the presentation from last time, like a review, or if there's anyone who was there and is present now who has already something that rather that I clarify. Or
One question I had from that last meeting was this process. It's actually related to the dog question. The selection, when we studied some Bogdanov, I think it was several years ago at this point that we had an SDP meeting about it. But I remember in technology, that idea of selection was like a core thing, right? And then with your presentation, it kind of rekindled that line of thinking about like the power of the environment is to affect what gets selected. as a given type, like what we consider to be a dog, for example, is like a type, but then there's subtypes of dogs, and these types are unlike mathematical types, which are kind of platonic in some sense. These types have a history. They have they have to be kind of molded over time. But I guess the question I had was how to distinguish between the capitalist forms of selection and the selection that already occurs in all organizational forms. And I think you already gave kind of an answer, but I think that's still a bit fuzzy for me, right? Because there are you could say like, whatever makes profit gets selected.
I see.
But I don't know what is exactly is the mechanism there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I that's also part of the reason why I thought a second meeting was useful, because I thought that the core of the presentation last time was gonna be this idea that I included it there, but it's like the last half of the presentation, which is can we really defend, and is there a good argument to be made that there is something like the constitution of nature for a given mode, and then that therefore social formations constitute nature in one way or another under a kind of layered, complex idea. So nature appears in a certain way. So I thought I was going to talk about, nature as a partner, which is like an extension of affinity towards nature as resource, nature as matter, which was the proposed term for what nature appears as in capitalism or under mode C. But then I realized that before I could get to that, I had to define something which we call nature, because if you can fall under a circularity, which is if you're saying something is constituted as resource, as blah blah blah, as blah blah blah, socially. So there is a distinction. For example, I think Maurice asked this at the end about physics and these concepts of nature, and I tried to propose the idea that I don't think physics is committed to a idea of nature, like if capital N, which is something that glues together every law of physics. So that gluing of everything that is into a nature, one nature, seems to be a social process. That's kind of what's at stake, right? So I thought I was going to go straight to that issue, but then I realized that I had to have a good definition that was not circular about what we're calling nature, so that this wouldn't be like something was socially constituted and now we are saying that this thing that's already a byproduct of something is itself the thing that is behind that process. You could get into some weird circular argument. So what I tried to do was, and that became half of the presentation, and that's why I don't think I got as far as having the means to answer what you're saying. I don't think that I think that I ended up having a different idea, which is the problem of distinguishing what counts as material basis. So I tried to create, I think I'll share the screen because it's the first crazy idea in those slides. And I actually was a bit embarrassed because I wanted to do something simple. I always end up doing 10,000 slides and it just looked too convoluted. But let me see if I can. Do you see the slide here? Yeah. So yeah, this was the first complicated idea that I tried to add. Let me see if I can add a cursor on top of this. Took so long the times where you could actually draw on top of this. Here. Yeah, so second. My cursor disappeared. One sec. Okay, where is that again? Here. Okay. So can you guys see the screen with the little thing, right? So what I was trying to do is, given this kind of more or less stable idea of like this summary of the categories we've been using to discuss our own version of what is this social atom idea, right? Which is basically just saying, if you want to glue together logical contexts, they need to abide to certain rules, so that if you have like some context here, a way of distinguishing, you have a situation, you have a way of distinguishing what matters from what doesn't. And now there's some other situation, and something will matter in that situation, and some things won't matter, which are around. And you want to say, well, somehow these things can be glued, because I can continue in the same game. I can continue in the same contextual. I'm expanding the context. Like, we exchange something here, we exchange something here, and we want to say that these two contexts are connected. Or we spoke about something, and then we spoke about something else later on, and we want to say that these things are actually the same conversation. So under which conditions can you glue these things, right? That was a way of introducing the idea of atoms and so on, all these ideas that Badiou presents, and we adapted to our purposes. So this was based on that, right? Saying, well, to glue together, if you have a context here that matters with a bunch of stuff that doesn't below it or around it, and you have here another context with things that matter, and a bunch of stuff that doesn't matter around it. What Badiou suggests is that if you are able to find and to define by abstracting some type of unit, atomic unit here, you can generate a sort of gluing of these things. So for example, we exchanged something for $10 here, you exchange something here for $20. In some sense, it's not equivalent, but if you can decompose this to $1, right, and you have like a bigger measure of how much things can be exchanged for. So if you have money, you can suddenly glue these things. So money becomes like a building block that captures this context with the same language. So you can now travel between them, something like this, right? So just trying to introduce the idea of atoms. And then I said, okay, but to bring nature, blah, 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 into this discussion, we need the category that Badiou doesn't have. So I try to divide his theory of atoms, of real atoms, into more categories that are implicit in it. And the core one is this one. So what does this mean? For example, imagine the context we're analyzing is a relation of affinity between people. People shook hands to say that they met, right? So you have some situation here where people met, and some other time, some other people are going to discuss that handshake. Perhaps you're going to discuss it with a third party afterwards. So here there's a handshake. Some things are important, some things are not. And here is a conversation between people later on about that handshake, right? Well, if you want to stay in the same kind of world as that handshake, you need to be able to decompose it into meaningful things. So for example, how long, if you shook the person's hand, whose hand you shook, you can't do it very, very, very crazily. You need to do it kind of within customs. So if everyone shakes hand very formally and you like hold the person's hand and kiss it, it might not establish a relation of affinity. It might just make you sound crazy. But there are things that didn't matter in that original handshake that might matter in the conversation. For example, you might ask the person, was the other person's hand sweaty? And they will say, yes, it was. At the time, it didn't matter. It was a handshake. It established a pact. But looking retroactively, you can decompose the handshake into some things. The fact that the hands were sweaty might mean that they were nervous, and that might be relevant to the affinity relations, right? If their hands were sweaty due to a medical condition, that is not relevant, right? So you can go to a building block and you can decompose it and to find something that exists in that context that is atomic. It's a small kind of thing. So you can decompose it in a way. So what I try to do is to say, well, there are all the logical things that exist in this context. There is all those things that don't count. So there are things that count, that exist. There are things that don't matter. Nobody cares. So if you start discussing, exactly how were the fingers positioned in the handshake, the guy who was in the handshake and who's now talking to you will say, that doesn't matter. Like, what are you talking about? If you go into that discussion, we're suddenly, discussing the aesthetic of something else, or we're going to a medical discussion. So you're changing context, right? But there is something in between the two. There are the things that count, that you can open, meaning you can decompose them and get more information that is meaningful. And there are things that count, but are black boxed. Meaning they need to be there, otherwise the social dimension doesn't exist, doesn't work. But you can't unpack them without leaving the context. So you see the difference. Like, there are things that don't matter at all. They're contingent, or they're like, at what position were the atoms in the person's hand? That doesn't matter. And there is no situation in which that would count, perhaps, right? While preserving the context that we are interested in. But there are some things that need to be there, like the hand needs to exist. The person needs to have a hand. And they need to be able to do a certain movement, right? But if you were to discuss those things, you would be leaving the context. You would be going somewhere else with that context, right? So that idea of something that is necessary, it's a condition, but if you were to analyze that condition, you would be losing the thing that it is conditioning. You would be going into a different context. It would be erasing relevant differences, right? That's how I propose we define something that is material. So it's a relative definition, right? There's no such thing as the material. Materiality is just the relative name for whatever it is that counts, but cannot be unpacked. So for example, the material support of speech is sound. And up to some point, we can decompose sounds and make them part of speech. Like, we can continue talking about sounds that we used, but there are a part of the sound that we use that, even though it needs to be there, like the very articulatability of phonemes, if I were to discuss those differences, I would stop focusing on speech. So you can have like it's almost like this scaffolding, right? You have something which is at the level of the logic, the differences that really count. Then you have the material support, which are, so here are differences that you can unpack. So they're open. You can divide them into further differences that matter. For example, you have a word, you can take a part of that word that's a sound with a grammatical function, right? But you can go a bit lower and you can go into the sounds that are necessary, meaning you need to be able to articulate the phonemes. But if you were to talk about these differences, if you were to make them legible and try to integrate them, you would lose the logic that you're interested in. So they take you to a different context. And then you have the realm of multiplicity, which is, everything else that doesn't make a difference in this context. Which doesn't mean it's lost or whatever. It's just, if you want to talk about it, you need to go to a different world, a different context. It's not really part of this thing here, right? So why did I need this tripartite division? Because my idea is that we define nature based on this. We're going to use this concept of materiality to define how are the closed but meaningful parts of the world included into the meaningful but open parts of the world, parts that we can decompose and recompose. So nature, with a capital N, will be the set of all material supports of a social world. There's a bunch of stuff which is indifferent to social worlds, and we don't consider it nature. If I've never seen like a hippie say, you know, the atoms, they are part of nature. Nobody says that. Like, you can go into a mystical thing when you then have a kind of cosmovision where, you know, we're all connected because all atoms, whatever. But you're like, the Planck scale is not really something that, you know, hippies fantasize when they think about nature. So there are a bunch of stuff out there which is indifferent to the material support of social worlds. And I'm proposing that even if it's a provisional approach, that's part of what I wanted to talk to you guys about, that we can talk about, let's say, natural things. There's a good meaning of natural things, of physis or whatever, that is beyond the scope of what I'm saying, of course. But there is something like nature with a capital N, this thing that appears to oppose the labor, oppose the work, and at the same time be the basis of labor, basis of work. That is the thing that we're always mentioning when we want to say, no, but we need to look at the material basis. Nobody says like Marxists should study physics because the material basis of everything is quantum mechanics. For some reason, we know that the material basis of a social system is below social difference, but above quarks. Why do we know that? Right? So that's kind of the thing we're trying to capture, and why it can take different forms. Sorry, Renzo, yeah?
Yeah, no, I have a question on whether you have, like, I'm interested in what's the criteria to characterize what is the logical and sort of like operational way to determine what's the material in a given situation. Like, and it came to my mind like three relations that seem to maybe fill that role. Like, one is supervenience, like when you have in philosophy like two properties, A supervenes on B if an A difference implies a B difference, right? So if the logical atom supervenes on the materials any logical difference has to imply a material difference, right? You cannot change some appearance, some like logical existence without a material also changing together. Otherwise, like, it would be the couple. So that's one relation. I wonder if it's like sufficient or if it's the second one is like, I remember that text that you mentioned once from Russell, uh, the fundieron or something, like the foundation relation, which is also has this thing where there's this sort of like weak link, like it's just something depend on the other, but there's no necessary, it's contingent, right? It's a contingent dependency.
So the example there was, for example, colors on space, right? That space, you cannot have color without a space, but the logic of color is not contained in the logic of space, right?
Yeah, that's a good, yeah. And the third one, I wonder if you could also have like a bit the inverse of supervenience, like if you perturb sort of like you do some manipulation, it's material if you induce like a change in the logical existence, but it's just being, or it's like this larger thing. If you perturb, it doesn't change. So if you perturb sort of the atomic thing, it shouldn't make a difference to existence. But if you perturb the material substrate, then there should be a change. And that the third example to me is like very clear in neuroscience, because like we work with brain stimulation, and the cool question to me is like, you can do like brain stimulation, and there are some ways that you can sort of like stimulate the brain electrically and no change will be made in like sensations. But if you like stimulate in the right frequency in the right place, then you sort of like see a flash, and then that means that you're sort of touching the substrate at the right deep, sort of the right, you're making the right type of difference that makes a difference to this sort of like logical space that in that case is sort of like phenomenal conscious phenomenology. So I wonder Yeah, that if you think it's like maybe it's approaching like a way to characterize this two things, because it's really tricky, right? Because it's like a dependency which is not, nothing follows because it's contingent, but at the same time it's necessary in the sense that it can, it's not like it has to be there, otherwise
Yeah.
there's no propagation.
Yeah, I have no idea. I wonder if we have to have, if there, I mean, if there are many constitutions of nature depending for with this very specific theory, right? It's not the general theory of how any logic talks to any material support. It's a theory of how social logics talk to material support. So it should already be more restricted, but also because social logics are very varied and complex because they're composed of many layers. I'm not sure I would venture like I like the three ideas you propose. They seem to all hint at the same thing, right? From different relations. So I would keep all of them. The core idea for me for now, it's simply the idea that I think the best example of this, the intuition for me about this came from Levi-Strauss, in fact, discussing nature and culture in elementary structures of kinship, and then his discussion of music and serialism and the destiny of it you know, atonal music and so on in the beginning of the mythologics, which I think it's a very weird text with some weird conclusions, but it has one insight which is very nice. But it's clearer in his other text, which is this idea, for example, let's say you have a clan, and clans relate through affinity logic, right? Kinship. And for Levi-Strauss, kinship precedes blood ties. But if you want to be able to connect with clans that are very far away and you never met, if you want to be able to store information about the affinity logic that is ruling certain clans' relation, there are some processes which have nothing to do with social reality, which is like the current status of our species in terms of sexed reproduction, which resonate under certain conditions with some aspects of affinity while being underdetermined in other aspects. So for him, he says hereditarity, it's like it just has like an open input here, an open input here, and it outputs something here. And this little machine of reproduction, it is actually, you know, it is there regardless of the social system. But what will go here and what will go here, it's up to affinity. So if two people have a kid, there are some DNA, genetic, blah, blah, blah that go on. But who will have a kid with whom depends on the social logic. So this propagates the affinity relations so that if you meet the child now, you can say, yeah, he's the son of Fulano. A bunch of social symbolic propositions follow from that, even though being the son of is actually relying on an underlying material process that has nothing social about it and nothing necessary, because we know not every society propagates its social characteristics through reproduction, human reproduction. Others propagate them by prey-predator systems and by other natural phenomena. So what I like about this is that I mean, this is just a nerdy interlude. There is a thing in categorical cybernetics called a cone. A cone is like an interface which has like it looks like this, for example. So you have like you have some systems, some functions going in and out, but it has like an empty slot that is missing. And you can put something here from the environment and it completes the system. But you don't need to know what's going on in this darker thing. It's like a black box. All you care for is that it has an input and an output. And the way that this input and output function preserves what is meaningful for the system. It's like a circuit board with the place where you put the processor and some other things, you know, you can add them there. So there is something to this that you get something like the logical side, right, which is the green part here. And there is something you're relying on, which is like a little black box that inputs some parameters from the logic, outputs some stuff, which is coherent with the logic, but you have no idea about what happens inside. And even if you do want to know what happens inside, to unpack this and look into it will take you away from what was meaningful for that interaction. So of course you can discuss human reproduction, but the moment you're discussing human reproduction, you're no longer discussing social reproduction. You went into a different field, and a lot of political criticism goes into the naturalization of social logics based on human reproduction, because it's just being conduced or reproduced or registered, right, and recorded by that material support. That material support is not necessary. You could remove it, right? Think of it as a comb I was mentioning, like this. And this is, let's say, clans and families, and these are clans, and you are concerned, you want these things to match. You want these things to make sense, to continue to make sense so that we can expand in a way that is mappable, right? And we have human reproduction here. If tomorrow somebody finds a way of doing this that doesn't include human reproduction at all, includes something else, but keeps the cohesion, we will just substitute one thing for the other. So I think that general idea is the core idea. So it's a relative demand. It's both a way of singling out what's material and a way of showing that material basis is relative. Depending on what makes a difference, some things are black box, some things are not. And then if you change what makes a difference, it will change what counts as a material support. But then what is the way in which the material is related to the logical? I think that it's better to be pluralistic about this and not assume there is one way, because we don't know enough about it, in my opinion, to be able to account for it. But even so, just to go back to what Dennis asked, like at this level, what the core word is propagating, in my opinion, not selecting, right? We don't even have a concept of environment at this point. So in the sense that the environment as the set of all constraints that make some pressure on a process in a world, right? We're at this time almost looking at the synchronic aspect. We're trying to look at this one thing that we usually treat it as, existence, the differences that make a difference, and we're trying to add a bit of fat to it, of things that are required in order for differences to make a difference, but those requirements cannot appear on their own, because we will then use them to construct our concept of environment. But this would be prior to that, right? It's also cool because it pointed to again to an old discussion we had about surrogate systems. Because what is this, right? If you take this little picture I drew to be something like this, where the logic is here, it's going here, but then there's also something that needs to go through here to be propagated. And we're gonna put some black box here, some process. We don't know very well how it works. It cannot be integrated. We couldn't just erase this and turn it into this. Just it's just a part of the world with all the other functions that are relevant. It is kind of opaque, right? And perhaps there is even some adjustment in order to match the two things. But this is like already a basis for surrogacy, right? The idea that you delegate to a process that is independent of the context, part of a procedure that is actually very relevant for that context, right? And but rather than thinking of this as a temporal process, I want to calculate, I take the calculator, it does the math, gives me the result. You can think of every process as having that distinction. It's a synchronous distinction for everything, right? So before we get to how can the material propagate or constrain, better spoken, right? How can it afford something to existence and not afford other things? So for example, if you wanted to totally transform society and how affinity and families are derived in such a way that you create a new form of family structure, if you don't change the material basis through which we make this propagation possible, meaning if you don't change reproductive rights, if you don't see bodily transformations in a new way, so it's still the same process that is meant to propagate the family, the same material basis, it's going to be very hard because it's going to constrain, it's going to select against the political change, right? Because it will store genetic material, and this is, let's say, similar or conductive, or it resonates, it has some synergy with certain forms of social organization that has less synergy with others, right? For example, for a totemic group, so if you have a clan that is organized in some confluence with the trait of a certain totemic animal, the traits that you want to see in the offspring to say that it belongs to the same clan has to do with your relations to that animal. It doesn't have to do with the passing on of genetic features. You can say, yeah, but he looks like you. And he clearly came from you too. Therefore, it's part of your family. And people can say, no, that's a false spirit. Clearly, this ugly son of a bitch belongs to a different clan because it has none of the properties of the kangaroo, you know? So it's tracking something else. So there is no necessity that is always the same material basis. But so I would say that at this level, these things here, the material support has more to do with recording, propagating, and things like this, than selecting and constraining. I mean, it does have something to do with constraining, but we would need more steps, I think, to arrive at how the environment then puts those constraints on us and on, you know, and creates a certain economy of affordances, which is something I'm going to try to develop on the 16th when we get to social stuff. But does that help, Dennis?
Yeah, it makes sense. So like one the difference between propagating and selecting is like synchronic, diachronic, and yeah, I can already kind of see we'll need to add more to it, right? Because there can be many ways to propagate, and you're kind of indifferent. You kind of just go. I think memes are kind of a good example. You look online, look at memes. Like memes, there's a propagating logic, which is like if your meme is shitty, then it doesn't really work, right? But there's also a selecting or a selection or a diachronic form where some memes change over time, they like evolve. They get shared or whatever, they get they become like common, they enter into the common like parlance or whatever of the internet. But that overall, the propagation itself is more like just the fact that does it work as a meme?
Yeah, I would separate it in these terms. Like propagation for me has something to do with taking the hand out of the wheel. So you can give it like a, how do you call a peteleco in English? Like you can kickstart it and trust that something which is independent from the context will propagate the traits of the context. You still need the context on the other side. So for example, we have a meeting, we're recording it on Zoom. Recording is like a computational process that's going to create a file. It's recording the sound. It records traits that are meaningful to us. But if people don't talk about the Zoom meeting afterwards, the recording in itself, it doesn't give a shit about the content. But we can retrieve the meaningful content out of that process on the other side. And we don't really care how the computational process of compressing information, it's not part of the Zoom conversation, right? So that's what propagation and recording and storage have to do with. And you can see why real atoms are, in that sense, the core of Badiou's greater logic, because his whole point, and this is also how you get to see how why socially it's so important, it's saying once you find the real, the point of abstracting, you create an abstraction, but it can serve real tendencies, it can serve real dynamics which are not social. They are scalable, they are generalizable. You can forget about social reality, and when you remind yourself of it, the data for where people stand are kept. I think our theory of racism, for example, requires this, because racism has everything to do with storing information about inequality, domination, onto totally meaningless traits of a material support. People have no choice but to reproduce traits that will be read, right, under racist acquire racist meaning, it'll be useful for racism via mere reproduction of people and survival, right? Because people bodies have colors, and that's not even in itself it requires this abstraction on one side, segregation, inequality, and so on, and then you can recuperate information about class and domination and so on from that totally meaningless information. So propagation, for me, that's the core idea. We managed to unpack a bit better why social processes whose differences are in accordance or resonance with some non-social processes, they have a better chance of scalability or expansion or durability. Whereas social processes that require us to constantly make the differences that make a difference count, because they are going against the grain of their material support, they have a much higher cost of reproduction and propagation, right? So, for example, you can get quite easily why reactionary and conservative political processes, they tend, because they want to use totally meaningless divides of gender, phenotypes, places of birth, they want to use this to propagate a certain social system. They tend to be less costly to reproduce, whereas political processes that want to treat everyone equally, therefore not rely on any particular trait, they sometimes are more costly, which is a bit of a paradox. Why shouldn't it be easier, right? So, but even though it's easier to access anyone, it's harder to propagate something determinate, because there is no bodily human trait you want to use as a determining factor. You can even see why singling out labor perhaps had that function, right? Because it distinguishes people who labor from people who don't, and it would allow to propagate a certain trait of a particular way of associating, right?
Okay.
But yeah,
I think I see what you're saying. Yeah. So basically, propagation is reading and writing to the material. Like,
yeah,
write something onto the material and then later on read it, recover it, and then selection has more to do with the cost of doing that operation over time. Like,
yeah. So
writing can be difficult it can be very difficult to write something, or it can be very difficult to retrieve something, more or less, right? And that those costs add up over time to create selection.
Yeah, I think selection, I mean, once we have a concept of environment, which in my opinion has something to do with, given a certain set of organizations, how is the world, which is bigger, more complex, constituted for that organization? So it's just the slice of the world you get to interact with. Then, given that, you see, suddenly you will create a new division between open and closed, or transparent and black box, because the external world is now black boxed. But it's now a black boxing that doesn't distinguish between the logical constraints and the material constraints. So it's harder to tell those apart. There's a nice dialectic, like synchronically, everything is either, it's at the same time logical and material. Diachronically, when you see a system, it is more or less open and the outside is now totally closed. And you interact and extract information through the interaction. And in that sense, now that closure makes it hard to tell what is material and what is logical about the environment, right? So it's like you have this little thing like this, right? As we were saying, like, here are the differences that make a difference, and we can unpack them, and here's the material. And then you will say, okay, but let's call this a system. And now we'll call this the environment. But you can't, now this is, the whole thing is black box. It's not just your own material, which is black box to you, right? As you said, read and write. Now this interaction is almost like the interaction with your own materiality. And then you experience trying to change what's around you with the same type of relation that you have when you relate to your own material basis. Because we can't tell what in the environment is differences that make a difference and what is the material support. This is sometimes foggy, right? So there's something about this movement to a broader discussion about environments and systems and interacting with the environment that should clarify also the difference between just this kind of more or less passive, but I don't think passive is necessarily the word, but more or less independent substrate of what is relevant, but it's a substrate that even though it's independent, it propagates relevant features, right? For example, to give a simple example, friends meet up for lunch and dinner and so on, but the fact you're going to be hungry is not social in the sense of it's not part of your friendship, but you can propagate your friendship by using the fact you're going to be hungry every couple of hours to invite your friends to eat with you, and you know they will also want to eat, right? That's an integration that is kind of synchronous. But the fact that you can go with your friends to some restaurants rather than others, and that involves both physical costs of moving, but also economic costs of the restaurant's price, right? That's more the selective, right? So I would say it's perhaps, I'm not sure if it's synchronic versus diachronic, but it's just that there are extra steps to get to the thing that you were asking, I think.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, it clarifies it for me.
Yeah, I even try, I didn't even go into this, but because this is so ridiculous. But one way I started to think about it is that, well, if you have existence as differences that make a difference and you can decompose them, you have the stuff that is indifferent, it's not part of that world, and you have the material support. Things that are not existing in the world, but they are required for it to function, right? If you have this triad, I was thinking if you could even use it to distinguish these different types of worlds, right? Like mathematics, physics, then what is an ecology and what are social worlds based on this? I'm not sure if this is just too crazy. I'm not even sure I agree with it anymore, but it seemed like an interesting use of this. Because, you know, this should have a consequence to this discussion we were having, right? In the paper that we're working on, we were talking about, okay, how are we going to define what is social about social worlds? And we had that idea of, well, if you take parts and wholes, in living systems, you can have three options. If the part is a living system and the whole is a living system, then it's an organic interdependence, right? The whole is a living creature and the part is a living thing. So the relation between these two things is like an organ in an organism. But if you have a living part in a non-living system, so the part is living and it's concerned with its own life, but the whole thing is not living, then you get something like an ecology, right? Because ecological system is not a living thing, but it's made up of things that are concerned with their lives. And then you would get a third thing, which is social independence, when the parts that count, even though they're based on living things, they are not directed at living directly, and the whole is not directed at living, even though the combination of these two things is how living systems reproduce. So a society is not necessarily directed at keeping everyone alive. Creating, like, stitching shoes is not an activity. You cannot eat the shoes afterwards. But if you sell your shoes, you get the money. With the money, you can then go and buy something. So none of those activities are actually straight directed at survival, but the combination of these things is, right? So that this would be a way of distinguishing these three things. And I was wondering if we couldn't use this and insert that distinction between material support, so the being, the material support, and the logical part into this, or existence into this discussion as well. But sorry, Ariel, you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I'm curious what concerned means in B2, because it's kind of seems like a strange definition to me as it stands.
Here.
Yeah, being living organisms concerned with their own individual survival. Like, what's the nature of that concern?
Yeah, I think it's still very vulgar, but like, what if we thought of something like, if you were to parse out the behavior of a bird, and even though it's definitely interdependent of other creatures, let's say requires the tree branches to fall so that it then picks up the tree branches, takes to its own nest, or it eats eggs that were laid by another bird or another creature, or it eats another creature. So definitely it's interdependent in a way that if those things were removed, its survival would be affected. But if you were to describe its actions, they are, let's say, the collection of that individual bird's actions amount to their survival. So it's like the conformation of the parts of an ecology. They concern living, right? They are actions that have a purpose, or they are directly related in their material consequence with producing life for that creature, with survival. Whereas in the actual actions of, I'm doing a shoe, I'm putting a certain color on a sneaker so that it sells, because this is the sneaker that sells for the most, so they can get the money, and then I need to go to the grocery store and I'm gonna buy this thing, which is the cheapest. None of those actions have anything to do with a person surviving. Right? I mean,
I guess I don't buy the distinction there on some level. Is part of this, in the sense that, like, I think there's a lot of, I'm not an ethologist, so what do I know? But like, I think there's a lot of animal behavior that's not necessarily like directed or concerned in a direct way. Like,
yeah, that's not a problem. I mean, there are social systems that are not human. Like, people use the structure of ant colonies they describe it as social behavior, not for nothing. Like being a soldier ant versus some other type of ant. It's not, it only aggregates to the ant survival if you look at the whole, even though the separating of that function is not itself conductive to that ant survival. It's described as a social system. I mean, other dolphins have social systems, other creatures have social systems, but even so, how do you distinguish? Why would you call that social system and not just regular independence? Because there are other types of interdependence which are not social between creatures, right?
Yeah, well, I guess part of my question is, like, where does the concern in here?
Where?
Yeah.
What do you mean by where? You mean, like, does it have to have an intentional purpose, something like this?
Yeah, is there an intentional purpose, or is it like, does it actually exist, like, in the individual, right? Because in a sense, like, I don't know, thinking of like of life, or, you know, like the interest of life is like in continuing. It's weird to talk about it this way, but like in continuing the you know, the life of the aggregate, or like potentially like of the species, right? So it can be kind of weird to talk about life on that individual level because it's a big statistics game. Like this is part of what Darwin's doing, right? Like the interest of life itself might be the concern with propagating life.
I don't know. I mean, my point. I think I'm being more less ambitious than that. I'm just saying, like, aren't there processes where if you just parse out what's going on in terms of these actions relate to, well, their consequence. I don't care what people are thinking. Even for social systems, I'm not sure if we need to talk about purpose, but so I would remove purpose from both. The concern here is not to say intention or whatever. It's just a vulgar way of describing, like, if you look at the behaviors that are differentiated, individualized, and so on, are these behaviors tailored to propagate something other than either the species or the individual survival? So why is something like division of labor a feature not only of humans but other animal groupings? But division of labor is not just interdependence of functions. Division of labor is interdependence of function, where the functions are changed to no longer be directly adapted to an individual or species survival, but only guarantee that survival when all those adapted functions are considered together. So if a bird were to drop a branch, and the branch now is picked up by some other creature, and they do something else, and so that then something falls, food falls on their nest, you know, in such a way that the dropping of the branch is now a new type of abstraction. It's you're dividing functions abstractly from a principle that you cannot track back to, well, if the bird does this, then the bird does this. By the nature of the material interchange with itself and other species, it gets to its survival. You get something slightly different. So, sorry, Renzo, yeah?
Just because I think I have a similar concern to Ariel. Because I also had some trouble with like distinguishing, because at face value, like the direct versus indirect by itself, like it seems to me it's not about like the presence of or not of mediation, the presence or not of some purpose. It's the impression I have is like ecological interdependence. There's this sort of it's stratified, like you have scales, like you have the individual, you have the gene, you have the sort of species and so on, but it has to be justified like at every level downward. Like it's like the Dawkins things, like you have ecology and then you go to the species, and the species has to survive, but it's actually the animal itself has to survive, which is actually just a vehicle for the gene. So at the end is like this sort of like downward atom, which has to sort of it's sufficient to, I don't know how to say, but the reproduction is sort of like from below, and while social has this sort of like appeal to totality, right? It's from things get justified from the point of view of like social reproduction of some sort of like social form, which is like global in some sense. Like it's the individual is just a sort of like a placeholder for some sort of like higher function, social function. So I wonder if that's a way to distinguish, like one is the sort of like reproduction from above, and the other is a sort of like reproduction from below, because on both cases, like you have survival, you need like survival. It's not direct versus indirect, it's like mediating both cases. It's not about purpose. So I wonder if this, like one, you have to be able to justify like by going down, like the gene has to sort of like propagate and reproduce. If not the individual, then the gene. If not the species, then the individual has to survive. While I feel like social metabolism is a bit the opposite. Like it's contingent. If I am the king, like what matters if the king is like propagated. It doesn't matter if, you know, this present, like people have singular histories in like they change history, but at the end it's sort of like this functions, this sort of like social structures that are sort of like being reproduced, right? That's what's relevant for social dynamics. It's not the sort of like the material realizer doesn't matter, while in ecology is the opposite. The material realizer is what's being it's not the material realizer, but you see what I mean? Like the sort of
Yeah.
unit of reproduction is going down. Like it's the gene, it's and so on.
Yeah, I think this is connected to this difference here that I tried to sketch, which is yeah, it's kind of small. I'm not sure if you guys can read it, but I don't think that I think Ariel's concern and I see it as not a problem. I agree, but the idea was this difference here. So what makes a difference? That's why I said I was trying to perfect that previous definition. I think that previous definition has a good insight, which is social systems are mid out, meaning what counts as the big picture and what counts as the part changes based on the logical coherence of the system. So what is the minimal unit that is relevant changes depending on how the coherence needs to be kept. So if everyone needs to become you know AI experts to sell their labor, we will change our lives to become that, and that will be the function that you operate. So the individuals that are part of this bigger thing, they're not constraining materially what the interdependence relation is going to be. The interdependent relation is constraining what individuals are, sometimes regardless of the material constitution. So social existence has a degree of freedom over material existence or material processes that is higher than in the case of ecology, exactly because of what you said, Renzo, because propagating the material basis, if it's a genetic, the individual, the species, whatever, is the thing that exists in the ecology. That's the thing in itself that makes a difference. So individuation and the propagation of the actual stuff is itself, even though the stuff is itself, that's a complicated concept, because here is already a form separated from just chemistry and physical stuff, right? Life is already separated from a substrate in a certain level. But regardless, those very concrete determinations, they are still the thing that is at stake. Whereas in the social world, the parts themselves are individuated in a way that is determined by something which is not life and not survival. You don't become a lawyer, or the profession of being a lawyer changes because of changes in what you need to do to survive, in the sense of material processes to get food on your mouth. You become this or that, so the parts are individuated downwards through the social division of labor, which is mediated by a problem of coherence of the whole. So that's slightly different than, rather than having, let's say, the starter problem of ecologists is, I have some populations, P1 and P2, and my question is, under which conditions of selection and adaptation will these two propagate themselves? And then you have the history of that is the history of that ecological niche. They might be changed in the process, but we'll still be tracking those populations and whatever happens to them. In social worlds, that's not what happens. What counts as the units to be tracked changes and is defined by the relation to the whole. This is not a human thing. This doesn't need to be human exceptionalism, and we don't care if intention is involved in the process or not. It might be even less intentional than this one here, right? So saying we need to propagate the species, let's do something about it, might be a very, very direct, intuitive, and conscious process even, whereas the fact that you're making choices and changing your life, none of it concerns your survival directly. You're not going to be able to guarantee your survival by becoming the guy that picks up pieces of cork in a factory. Like that has nothing to do with surviving, right? So it's even less, I would say that it's more appropriate to use intention in the cases of ecology than in the cases of social worlds, if you will. But in a certain sense, we're not discussing that. We're discussing how are parts and wholes abstracted with regards to life selection, even if that life selection is totally blind, right? Regardless of intention. So I don't think we're there yet. I totally agree. I agree with Ariel's concerns, like that there's something to, it's not really that, but just the general gist of it, you see that where the distinction is going. It's more a matter of, are the parts and the combination of parts primarily reproducing these material dynamics, or are the parts and wholes reproducing this, the logical dynamic, and the material part is almost parasitizing that and constantly being reshaped, right?
Yeah, just a further comment, because I think, I'm not sure it, like, I feel it's not maybe sufficient to just like say that like ecological reproduction is more like based sort of like closer to the material, and in the social you have this sort of like decouple. I still wonder if a way to do it is by like this direct, so say both are about like a reproduction which is based on some sort of interdependence, right? So it's interdependent reproduction of some sort of form. But I still feel like it's the dependency between the sort of like forms, it goes in a different direction. So in ecological reproduction, I feel like the dependencies go downward, such that what you need is that the small is not that you can go down infinitely and you're still within ecology, right? So atoms and like non-living things are not part, but like and sort of like, I don't know, there's not everything that is material, but the thing is that the lowest part you have has to be, there's a necessary reproduction that has to be guaranteed. And if you think about it, like a way to test this is like a gene, if you perturb a gene, if you change a gene, this difference propagates up. So you get like a mutation. A mutation is something like you changing this lower atom, you get a different phenotype, and then you change the sort of like reproduction of the whole, everything that depends on it, right? It goes sort of like propagates up this difference. But and then you have to like, and then you have this, all these forms that get reproduced, but what's matters is the gene. While I feel like in social reproduction, you have the opposite form of dependency. Like you can, for example, with the king example, you can perturb who's the king, and it's very sort of like plastic. Like you can, it dies and then someone else's goes in, and then, you know, you have ways to sort of like substitute to that. It's not like a gene. Like if you perturb the person, the function is sort of like robust to these changes, right? Now, if you perturb and if you drop the king, then maybe if you perturb the function of the king itself, then you might, I don't know, if you're still within an aristocracy, like a monarchy, like you have like a different family assuming and so on. But at the end is like the sort of global function that is being sort of like reproduced. So it's the dependency it's the other way around, right? The system, like the monarchy, is what
Yeah,
the lower
I see what
forms,
you mean.
you know what I mean?
Yeah, but I think it's, I mean, we can go further into this, but my idea is that I think that this is capturing this difference here. Like anything you change to a living creature, you're affecting the discussion. Like you're already, there's no way to change something into anything that concerns life and not change the history of life. But you can change things in living creatures and not affect the social history, because not everything that is concerning the material reproduction of living things is part of social reproduction, right? There is a gap, which is similar, is like the repetition of the gap between everything that is chemical, physical, and so on, which not everything is necessary for the material realization of a living creature. Life is already decoupled or has a certain degree of independence with regards to, you know, specific material things. You can change the material substrate and keep the form, and within certain parameters, that's still the same gene, right? And so on and so forth. But once you touch on that, something that is concerned, it's part or is implicated or is at stake in life and maintaining something alive, if you change that, you're changing everything that is relevant to the ecology. So that's not the same to the case of the social system. There is almost like an analogous degree of separation between material forms, dynamics in general, and those that are conducive or not to a given social space.
So I'm noticing something. If I can kind of, and it's that like I like the explanations that you've been giving, like a lot in this past little bit. And I think part of what's helped me understand them is identifying what the gap is that doesn't exist in the previous thing.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, there's a way that I think flipping the description and describing what social interdependence is, and then ecological, and then organic,
Mm-hmm.
is an order that's much more intuitive to me, because there's a way in which between each step, it's easier to identify
I see what you mean.
the gap and the thing that's not determined in the previous system. So like that would be helpful just from where I'm sitting for like understanding what's going on.
No, that's really
perspective.
useful, man. I'm gonna take note of that. Just so I know to think about it when we move forward. But like, again, even if this is not sufficient, I just felt like introducing this idea of a material substrate that we were discussing before, it helps make those distinctions that we were already striving to before. It just gives us an extra layer, which ultimately goes with the direction of what you're saying, Renzo, like what you're calling upwards or downwards, which I think I follow, but I think that to me, it has less to do with upwards and downwards and more with moving in any direction. Are you remaining inside a similar realm, or are you changing realms, in the sense of anything that happens to the gene needs to have an effect on a, you know, population, for example, that has an effect, even if it's minor, but it could potentially have, right? Whereas there is some level in which it looks like the order of determination inverted, because the king remains a king regardless of if the population is now more redhead than it was before. Even if it might affect, and let's say the king now has an affair with a redhead maiden, and now everyone will know, because now this, but under very specific conditions will that genetic change propagate to have a social effect. So it's not a given. In that sense, it matches the idea that downward and upward. So yeah, downwards is social, upward would be ecological or something like this. But I think since we want to keep the distinction inside every one of these domains, there is downward and upward with, you know, studies on evolutive biology. So I don't think that could be a primitive distinctive trait. But regardless of this, I think that for now at least, I mean, there's a lot of stuff I'm taking note here, so I can try to go back to it later. The core thing that I thought was useful for us to keep is that the introduction of this relative concept of materiality that it has traction in a previous discussion about what constitutes social worlds versus things that are not social worlds, in a way that doesn't require us to reintroduce human exceptionality or anything like that. And then what I try to do is that this should be the basis. I think I added this somewhere here. God knows where this is. Yeah. I try to use this two things. So our discussion of what makes a social world, and this idea about material supports, meaning dynamics that are kind of independent of the social logic, but the social logic latches onto them, right? And in a certain sense, that's a way of thinking how social reproduction latches on to human reproduction. It can play around, it can discard, it can abstract from human reproduction in order to reproduce the social system, but we are stuck with that indirect chain of relations And we're stuck with the changes to the chain of relations coming from the social space to get to an idea of nature that makes sense with the rest of the stuff we've been doing, right? So that's kind of where I was trying to get at. So the idea is that that social atoms, so these little things here, they need to have a basis on living systems. So that's a condition coming from our definition of social worlds, right? That they do concern life. And again, whose reproduction, the reproduction of these living systems is guaranteed by the logic of a social world. So part of what, so the comb, right? You get that little comb structure, right? So this is social, and this is non-social. So it's like a physiological thing. The social propagates itself through the physiological, and the physiological will need the social to complete its own circuits. It's like I'm a self-sufficient creature. I don't need anything, but from time to time I pass along a meme. No, I require my YouTube page to have this many subscribers, which is a stupid thing, just so I can get to monetize it, to use the money to buy groceries. So the non-social is stuck with the social, but the distinction between the two remains, because from the standpoint of what's social, not everything that it relies on matters, right? Even though it still relies on it. And so you get this, and then from this, the idea is that you can generate new social parts out of this. So even if you start with the idea, which is the classic Marxist, and Karatani develops this, right? That you want to start with this, let's say, human and human interaction, so interpersonal or directly social relations, but nothing prevents you from expanding this to include, under the criteria of coherence, humans' relations to non-human systems and non-human relations to non-human systems, right? And is this expansion, further expansion, like generating combs like this with things here that we cannot, there are kind of black box to us. So you put here, for example, not only other humans, but you don't know anything about them. You just rely on them. But you can put non-human things as long as they preserve the social logic. You can interact with them socially. But even you can put huge chains of non-human interactions with non-human things, as long as those things preserve. So on the other side, I can recuperate traits that I can connect back to the social space, right? This is pretty much, this is like anthropology one-on-one on animism, right? The whole theory is that the relations of kinship that people establish between each other and that they talk about in terms of having childs. Like if you look at Descolat's work, Philippe Descolat, his doctorate thesis, so he's a great anthropologist, he studied with Levi-Strauss. His doctorate thesis was about the way in which some people in the Amazonia, they describe, not just in terms of convention, but they have practices to relate to plants and animals that are extensions of the way that they relate to their own structures of kinship, right? So you have that expansion. So the idea is that we can just generalize this with precaution to arrive at this first thing, that there will be parts of the living systems that do not correspond to any biological relevant components, and they will be integrated. So actually, if we wanted to make a little, sorry, let me just erase this. If you wanted to make a little typology of the kind of expansion of the social towards the material, we could start like this, right? There's the material support of some social being. Socially, I'm going to remove human here. I'm just going to have social. Social creature, why not, right? You can have how you relate to non-social parts of yourself, things that have no meaning socially. So parts of living systems that do not correspond to any biological relevant components, like gestures can acquire social significance. Positions that you put your body in, the stages of life, none of these things are social in of themselves, but they are caught up in that process, and they acquire certain effectivity under certain conditions, depending on how they propagate and are recording and are captured by the social logic. Then you can have a second type of interaction, which is when you have another system of this sort and this type of relation, so between human things. Then you can have, when you just have a material thing, it's not necessarily already socially, it wasn't produced as a social thing, or it's not a living system. But you then expand this to include it as long as it has a certain type of relation. And then you can have relations between these material dynamics themselves being included, right? So this is what is described here. So parts of living systems can acquire social efficacy. Living systems whose reproduction is not fully or even partially dependent on social world. So other species, forests, whole biomes, pets. Non-living systems whose reproduction is fully conditioned by the social system. So tools, buildings, devices, they can acquire social significance as well in this expansion. Non-living systems whose reproduction is not even partially dependent on the world. So deep earth structures, the weather, the stars, all these things can acquire social significance, and they can be meaningful in the sense that if you put them here in our little social comb, as I called it, changes to them will affect the social system, right? They're not just contingent things that make no difference. They might make a difference, right? So you have many ways in which the social world can, under certain conditions, and those are now, we can define them as logical conditions, because we know we're looking for non-social dynamics that nevertheless propagate, store, record, or respond to differences that make social difference. All these things, under certain conditions, can be included in a social world, right? All of this can be integrated as long as they propagate the logical form of the world in question. And my proposal is that we call nature the name of the set of all material supports of a given world. So the idea that when you, and it makes kind of intuitive sense from the standpoint of a social reality, when you try to gather the material basis of a living system, living systems that are, we partially depend on, living systems we don't depend on. All these things together, they kind of name nature, and at the same time, we gain a nice kind of conceptual tool, because we can say, yeah, this is a potentially infinite process of adding things to the world and making them appear as nature, meaning they appear as if there is a set of all black boxes on which we directly, indirectly depend on, or don't depend at all. So this is kind of a social constitution of the outside in some sense. But this is not everything. This is because any process that cannot be stitched into a world will not be part of what we call nature, right? And the process of stitching itself can be different. So not all nature will be constituted for every social system in the exact same way. So even though you get some theory of, the totality of everything which is resistant to social or to humans, or resistant to or outside of what makes a difference socially, but nevertheless is part of it. Like, even though you still get this kind of totalizing concept, you still get a particular concept, and you can make a history of these concepts, right? So yeah, this was, I don't know, I lost count of the weird ideas that I proposed at once in that presentation. I'm not sure if it makes total sense, but this is kind of the basis from which I was trying to build what came later, right? So after this, we go into the analyzing, like, well, if this is true, we should be able to apply this first to the three social logics on their own. So knowing something about what a paraconsistent topos looks like, so what social relations are under mode A, this should give us a perspective on like a concept of nature under mode A. And it should have some features rather than others, right? And the same for mode C and for mode B. And this is what I try to do in the second part of the presentation, to show, yeah, it actually fits. So if you start looking at how nature emerges in societies that are mode A dominant, right? And I was using this kind of graph-based idea for talking about the type of symmetry and the type of negation and complements that you get on paraconsistent logic, hopefully in a more intuitive way. But if you try to look for this, you will see that under those two conditions now, right? The first condition is things that form material support for worlds based on mode A, and second, that whose material support, right, this is actually implicit in the first, is conductive to the logic of A, right? If you start looking for these things, you find them. So that was the interesting thing, to realize that if you look at, you know, discussions by, I mean, it's a huge discussion from Lévi-Strauss, but currently this post-Lévi-Strauss structuralist tendency, it's been called the ontological turn in anthropology and so on, that's bringing animism back as a fundamental category. So these guys, but also other discussions on how gift-giving, reciprocity, the type of symmetry it implies, constitutes the other, even if it's a non-human other, as a type of partner that has agency, and you need to be able to presuppose all sorts of properties on this either human, non-human, or whatever partner, in order to be able to continue to stitch together a social space. And this is done in such a way that you tend to, like, the nature that appears is not everything that is out there, everything we depend on, but it tends to highlight and make salient non-social processes that are resonant with mode A sociality. So the type of phenomena that is independent from social life that gets highlighted are phenomena that have a paraconsistent flavor, right? So even if inside they remain black boxed, if you're feeding them with mode A kind of logics, they are pretty good at giving you a consequence that has a bit of a mode A flavor on the other hand. So things like I wrote here, like things that are symmetric, conductive to this symmetric logic of establishing a boundary that belongs both to A and B, right? So prey-predator systems, sexual reproduction, cycles of circular cycles like the sun and so on, the mourning of dead people because they're gone but they're here, that's why you're mourning, the logic of orality and speech where the other is outside but it's constituting meaning, all those things which you find highlighted, or many of the things you find highlighted in this type of social systems as being nature as a partner, they have this kind of mode A flavor to them. So you get this resonance, right? This idea that we were seeking to evaluate, if it is true that the black boxes here, meaning the material supports of these social systems, are they conductive to that social system? Are they integrated in that social system? Yeah, it looks like they are, right? So I tried to do this for the three modes, and following a conversation I already had with Moscardi a long time ago, we ended up proposing this. Let me see if it's here. Where did I add this? Yeah, this triad, right? Where you can see that doing this process to bind together everything that serves as a material support to mode A, be interpersonal, non-human, or totally independent. But when you do this, nature appears as a partner, right? And this has a certain feature to it. It just propagates through these material supports the logic of mode A. And it's much easier to thread and to stitch together actions, context, social context on if you continue to work on mode A. In those cases, nature responds, right? That doesn't imply any type of weird primitive behavior. you still will act this way if you're interacting with the prey-predator system now, and you wanna, eat some creatures, but not exhaust the system, because you might eat from there again. You will see that you will automatically, by the very nature of what that material system is and how you relate to it, be pushed towards a more affinity-based gift-giving reciprocity kind of system, right? And the hardest thing I try to present, which for me is still a bit of a confusing bit, is that usually this is easy to see. A lot of literature goes on, we used to treat nature as a partner, but then something happened. But it's rare to find literature that separates the other two. Usually they're treated as if they're the same thing. Treating nature as a raw material, which I associate with mode C and with intuitionistic kind of, or just regular topoi, and treating it as a resource, which we're associating with mode B and a more classical decomposition of space and time and so on. Usually these two things are just equated as if they're the same. And they're not. So it was hard to find a way to make that distinction clear. Though I think it's very useful. And of course, in our own schema, we're not saying that these things are totally separate. If a world is made up of all these different logics at the same time, you're going to find these three things mixed together anyway. So we want to be able to get to the mixtures, but it's interesting to find a way of distinguishing the two before, right? And does this make sense up to this point, guys? I'm not sure if it's...
Yeah, it makes sense to me. Especially the partner and the affinity logic and the propagation, it all fits really tightly. But again, yeah, like you were saying, the raw material and resource distinction feels newer. It feels like it's underdeveloped compared to the partner thing.
Yeah. The thing there that I think is also, it's partially the fact that we've done much less work on the state than we've done on capital. And I think we've oscillated. John already left, but John has a lot of experience on this because we've tried to work on the state together. And I think that at least I started with the impression that the state should be the most sturdy, ossified, kind of chunky logic. And when you start separating the state from capital and asking about the logic of state and looking at empires and big dynasties and things like this, you see that the state is actually, and you can also derive this from the very formal principles we're working on. The state is actually the most plastic of the three. Like a lot of intuitions that I had about it are kind of changing. The first is this, that the state is actually quite resourceful, because if you look at this, right, logically speaking, just to simplify a lot, mode A has a lot to do with paraconsistency. Implies you have true, false, and then everyone defines a third term here in different ways. There are cleany logics, which are indeterminate. You have contradictions, which are both true and false. You can have many things, right? Mode C is all about having truth, falsity, and then kind of things that are in between. They're a bit true and a bit false. But if you look at carefully, like the fact that classical logic is just true and false, that means it is already contained in the other two. It means it is kind of a subcase of the others, which means that it's the perfect thing to mediate between them, right? So it has very clear limitations, like the systems you can build if everything in it behaves classically. They have very well-studied limitations in mathematical logic, in fact, but at the same time, if it's weird to take, like, I must say, I started thinking about this with some very perverse pleasure when I realized that a lot of French philosophers who looked into China and the ancient Chinese ways of dealing with the flow of things, to look for this kind of virtuous, pragmatic art of the opportunity, they were looking at the philosophers of the state. They weren't looking at the critics of the state. They were looking precisely at the first ideologues of big dynasties of how to stitch together thousands and thousands of different communities into a common state. And that artfulness of finding in a complex tapestry of communitarian commercial relations a subcase which is classical and which is valid for anyone, which is disinterested, which is functional, and so on. That's actually what the artistry of the state, seeing like a state, is all about, right? So that was the first counterintuitive thing I started to realize, that there is a very specific plasticity of mode B thinking. It's not like putting like Kafkaesque kind of structure in place. It can be like the most complex, detailed structure of profound analogy and building of hierarchies and orders amongst all these different things. Very complicated. It becomes this sturdy, ossified thing when you get to the modern nation state, because it's meant to be, it functions well in that way. The other thing that I realized is that, well, if you need to use those three, if we use those three distinctions we had between mode A, one way of thinking about paraconsistency is thinking that you have like a boundary. So when I separate A from non-A, I still need to account for the boundary. The boundary is in A and non-A potentially, right? So you have three things when you distinguish A and non-A, and so on and so forth. When you distinguish things in mode C, you have like a margin. Like here's A, here is kind of non-A, and here is definitely non-A, but here is like, it's like a fuzzy boundary, right? It's very different from mode A, the mode C. And for mode B, you have what we're calling a cut, meaning if here is A, this boundary belongs totally to A itself and not to B. So it's like a cut between the two, right? And when you start thinking about what does it mean to look at the world, to look at non-social things in this way, where there is a cut between A and non-A, and everything which is A is on one side and nothing was left on the other. It's hard to find in non-human, non-social things, just material dynamics out there, things that preserve this boundary. And then I realized, well, there is one thing which does this very well, which is life. Life needs to preserve a boundary between itself and its outside. And then it became also clear that the state is the most life-preserving, kind of life-concerned of the modes. Like, life makes a difference to the state in a way that it doesn't make exactly a difference to mode A or mode C. Mode B is much more, it's looking for functional things, right? Things that preserve their own function, reproduce their own functions. So I think I added this here somewhere too, right? That's material supports of social world that abide to classical logic. It's funny because on the one hand, most material things due to entropy are very bad for the state. So if the state wants to, say that this place in the world belongs to you and doesn't belong to anyone who's outside of it, or only this, your liberties end here, it's all this weird policing work to constantly separate what has a property from what doesn't, because interdependence between parts, entropy of objects, all these things get in the way of preserving this classical property of a cut. But life, or states of nature, so life and death, stages of a crop, classifications of species, hierarchical dependencies of living functions, pronounced physical and physiological features, things that can be cut off out of the world and be totally separated from the world, they are things that the state cares about because they are conductive of classical logic, right? So the hardship is thinking of where does the raw material versus resource thing come in? The idea that resources have more to do with extracting something which has already a property. So the property is in that part of the world and you're extracting. So a forest is a resource of wood. The wood is in the forest. It's, let's say, a property that the forest already presents, and you're just protecting, enclosing, like a mineral, for example, is a resource in that sense. But the moment that you're looking at graphite and thinking that graphite could be infinite things, and what properties it will have will come about through the labor process. It's not already available in the graphite, for example. Then you're looking at raw material. You're not looking at resource, right? So air is a resource when you think of it in terms of the properties it already has and that you're going to monopolize or enclose or alienate. Air as a resource, but air as a source of, you know, carbon that we're going to remove, carbon dioxide we're going to remove from the air pollution. We're going to mix it with some liquid and we're going to turn it into fuel for new cars. We're going to sell that fuel. That's air as raw material, right? And the limits of that part of air that you're going to treat as raw material, they're not given. They're margins. There is like the marginal utility of air. Why not? Right? Depending on the labor process it goes in, it will acquire certain properties or another. So the limits of the properties it has are still to be determined by a procedure. Whereas natural resources, the functions and properties it has are already appearing with nature itself, right? As part of nature. That's why we thought of calling the third thing matter, raw material or matter rather than resource, because it has no properties. It's just the, you know, the basis for properties to appear, whereas resources have properties, right? Does that make sense? Like, does that path of distinguishing make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think I remember last time we were discussing this near the end, but like the act of enclosing or creating a cut, like you said, wood in the forest. You just want to create a cut and say, okay, now this wood is now the property of the state, or this wood can be you know, used for these purposes. Like you can only cut these trees down if you have this type of permits, for example. That's not changing what wood is. Like that's not changing what the tree is for, right? That's, but then when we're talking about turning wood into some material for building something, then there's a kind of indifference to the properties themselves, right?
Yeah, for example, another way of saying the same thing is that from the standpoint of the state, you manage the resource, right?
Mm-hmm.
A resource is to be managed, but a raw material is to be worked. So managing means that you have some domination over it and you want to preserve, not preserve some features, but the features need to be there. You're managing the features, right? So nature appears as a resource when it appears, like part of what is appearing in that social space comes with certain properties. You would describe it as, yes, it is tall, it is good for this, good for that, and so on, right? But when you're describing raw material, that's not, nature appears as raw material, it's not appearing with properties that are inherent to its parts. The properties that matter are the properties that appear once it's combined with means of production and labor and so on.
Okay, then just think of a question like, is money raw material or resource or partner, or is it all three? You know, does it have
money? What do you mean by money? You mean like the paper? Because would you agree to say that money is like as a natural thing? You wouldn't probably, right? So what is this? Money is a difference, a social difference. Then you can ask, what's the nature of the support of money? because money
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah,
grow on
like
trees,
gold.
Dennis.
Like gold would be.
Yeah, gold. I think it's a good example. Yeah. Right. You can manage gold reserves because gold has certain properties. It's used by banks to issue gold coins or used to guarantee certain standards of exchange. That's looking at the natural properties of gold and managing that resource due to its natural properties, right? Gold is a raw material. The moment that you're not looking for gold for the properties that it has as gold, but the properties it could have once you decompose it and recompose it without respect to its form, right? To do like, because gold under a certain pressure acquires a certain property, so you put it through that process to create an alloy that can go then on spaceships, right? Or on jewelry or whatever. Doesn't need to be like a nice feature, but I think that it has something to do with, I mean, that's why material versus resource, right? Resource seems to be about property and function. And I mean, if we just go back to mode B, generally plunder and redistribution, right? You need to take something away, but manage, right? But you're taking something away. So it starts by having some property to be alienated from it. Whereas mode C, it's just commodification through this type of abstraction where the properties and the form that it takes is whatever it needs to take in order for the product to have value. I think there is a quote here by Mom that is useful. Yeah, he calls it just nature being a substratum, subordinated and subsumed under purely quantitative logic. So, you know, the value that's on the other side and whatever use value that you need to have on the object so that it sells for a certain value, that's the property you're looking for. It doesn't matter if the thing has that property naturally or if you need to almost push it in that direction, right?
Yeah, I think that's what's confusing because we're saying that this substratum relationship is happening in all three, right? So
yeah, it's just that Mom used the same term here, but substratum, I mean, this is his jargon, right? So but it's just to show that he's trying not to call it resource. He's trying to call it like something which is just the stuff, right? I think we could have called it stuff rather than that raw material, right? It's just to show that it is more devoid of its own form than here. That, I mean, you're making me have to talk about dogs, because this is why this is how I got to it. It's just the difference between. I'm gonna skip this old one here, which is really interesting about mode A. But I mean, just going. Okay, why skip it, right? These guys are currently studying how hominization and canization, the transformation of dogs and the wolves into dogs, happened, and they're currently looking at this interesting hypothesis that there was a sort of coevolution and domestication between I forgot the name of the late Pleistocene wolf that gave rise to dogs, but the idea is that there is a sort of symmetric process, meaning humans were able to expand a certain social form of affinity, certain social logic to include wolves, because wolves already had certain properties in their packs. They were already very social animals. They already it was part of their evolution to distinguish members of the pack by, again, functions that are not directly related to those wolves' survival. They would only survive if they adopted that function and the pack as a whole managed to hunt. So there was similarities between humans and wolves. Then wolves and humans start living together so the human habitat and the wolves attached to that habitat in a way, and then humans and wolves change together in a kind of symmetric, weird way. And then you start getting a different type of description of wolves of dogs much later. So this is like 31,000 years ago, and then around 17,000 years you start getting drawings of wolves, and they have this very nice animistic distinction of the mask of a wolf and something else behind, which is a classic trait of animism, that animals are only different in the surface, but they have the same soul behind as us, right? And then around 4,000 years ago, or 6,000 years ago, you start seeing photos of dogs that are trapped at home. This is like a beware dog sign, a very old sign that you should be aware of a dog that is protecting your property. 4,000 years ago in Pompeii, you get similar things of beware of dogs in China 6,000 years ago. And up to around 1400, you get this, which is a nice kind of moment where you find this treatise on dogs by this guy called Johannes Caius. And you see that the way that they define what a dog is and which type of varieties of dogs exist. So how do we look at dogs? Of course, there are thousands of varieties, in fact, right? But the way that they do is that they only recognize 16. And they're all based on this, like setter, water spaniel. Yeah, and dogs that do this, dogs that do that, shepherd's dogs, things like this. He's grouped under types of 3 large categories, all utilitarian: hunting dogs, pet dogs, dogs that did menial work. All large dogs are mastiff dogs. All lap dogs are spaniel gentle. So it's a functional distinction based on what dogs do, right? If that dog does this, or if the dog is better for this, then it falls under this category, right? And of course, people bred dogs, but they bred dogs to enhance those properties that dogs had. So if your dog is a good hunter, you're going to breed it with other hunting dogs to get an even better hunting dog, right? So that's what I'm calling a functional classification, and that's already a different logic than the symmetric logic of domestication. And then you get what is this Victorian explosion, which is a very modern phenomena, which is nice because you see that suddenly this functional commitment to, or better, this commitment to something functional about the dogs is lost, and you breed dogs regardless of whatever they do or their properties, right? So that's why they say that the multiple forms that we see today of dogs are very, very recent. By the time of Victoria, only you had one term, which was to breed, right? And dog breeds were something entirely new, defined by their form, not their function. So you can then just start creating all these different types of dogs. Just there is nothing about the dog other than, let's say, if you manage to mate them, that prevents you creating a new breed, right? And that's how we get at this ugly, crazy Pekingese dogs and pinchers and things that can't even breathe. So you can, my point is that one thing, that's how it worked for me as a useful kind of contrast the idea of looking at what dogs do already, what type of function they perform, and separating them into those types: runner, lap dog, menial labor dogs, and so on, right? And then you breed them to perfect these functions. And they can, you can use these distinctions to also have menial labor dogs are not aristocratic dogs, and so on and so forth. So you can mirror your social structure on the hierarchy and classification of these dogs and so on. But still, there was something functional that comes along with the non-human part of the world. Here is different. You have 2 dogs. What properties? You're not gonna allow the dog to dictate with which dog it should be bred. You're gonna just mix them together and produce an ungodly creature that can't even stand on its legs. This is a dog, guys. I swear. This is yeah. Whatever. You see my point, right? So there, for me, it is kind of useful as a distinction between these two things, like to separate. They call it form and function, right? But for me, perhaps it can be seen as the dog here. Whatever it does, whatever property it has, is not guiding, it's not helping to, it's not conducive to what we're socially going to do with it. The social process can go against the dog functions, the dog properties, the dog qualities, and so on, to produce a new quality, which is what matters. So if somebody wants to pay money to create the smallest dog in the world, you're going to do it, right? It's different from looking at the dogs that are around and trying to enhance a characteristic that they already have and manage the characteristics that dogs already have. Does that make a difference? Like, does that help to clarify this?
Yeah. I guess the only counter argument there is like, for example, some people think, pugs or whatever, the dog you said that can't breathe, right? It's they're cute. So cuteness is a property that you could say was innate in even the original dogs. Wolves, some people might think wolves are cute. Then it's just that over time that concept of a cute dog is, that's what led to this Victorian explosion, because they're exploring all possible forms of cuteness. But it's not like that property didn't exist in the past. It's just it became it's a matter of degrees, right? So you have like less reliance on the dog as a work dog, but more as like a dog that you have as a companion or as a social status symbol or something like that. But
yeah, I think what I wrote here to Moritz, I think, has something to do with this. Like, think of it in terms of how it appears. So it's not that it is. Of course, dogs are all these things all the time in many more things. But the idea is that if you constitute a social world dominated by mode B, to be socially effective, the tendency is that nature appears to have inherent properties that are available for extraction. So the properties appear to be part of that lump of the world, right? Whereas, and I think this is a really important distinction for example, ecological movements. It's very different if your enemy does not look at reality as if lumps of nature come with inherent properties. Like, it doesn't matter. It's not that there aren't. There might be, and they might consciously say there is, but it doesn't make social difference that it is that they have. So, for example, when the Brazilian government tells companies they shouldn't exploit Amazon because Amazon is the lung of the world, like it produces all the oxygen, whatever. Like, it's not that the capitalist doesn't want to listen to it. It's that financially speaking, they might make a math in their head and say a calculation that says, what if we create an artificial lung for the world and you allow us to cut the Amazon afterwards? Like, if we manage that, would that be okay? Because it doesn't matter. Like, it's not socially effective for value and for capital that material things have inherent properties. Because if I can just decouple the matter from the form, and they will try to do it, then that's fine, right? So nature is not constituted as a black box whose inside are differences gathered under properties to be ordered hierarchically and managed, which is more state-like. For capitalism, material black boxes are there to be, you can break them, decompose them in smaller parts, and recompose them in whatever you can. As long as you can constructively do it, that's fine. Constructively meaning step by step and through a how do you call it, like a accountable, costly and reproducible way, right? So that's even the case. Like things that have properties that are not reproducible don't even have properties for value. So if a type of wood once burned differently, but I cannot consistently burn it to produce a certain effect, it doesn't have that property, for example, right? Or if wood has certain properties that are more accessible, like build houses or to be sturdy, but if you break it into the smallest bits of carbon, it acquires some other property. Well, depending on the market, we will go with that much harder to find property rather than the obvious immediate property. So properties are totally relative and dependent on production and exchange. Whereas for the state, nature would appear to have properties, and they are clearly imputations. They're not like the given. They're still the properties that we manage to see them, right, at some point. So probably there's a lot of natural resources that and riches that old empires didn't know they should manage and enclose and treat as if there is some amazing property in that part of the world. They just didn't know. So it's not like it's given. But whatever appears tends to appear as if it has inherent properties. So that's what a dog story kind of tells. Like, of course, dogs can do many things and so on. But for a state, it is as if the dog appears to have certain features that comes with being the dog, and you need to manage those features. You will kind of cherish the ones you like, try to remove the features you don't like, right? Order the dogs in certain ways based on those features and so on. It's different from looking at dogs and not seeing property at all as an inherent thing. And then you say, well, these dogs can be many things. Let's see what sells. And it's different way of looking, right?
Yeah, no, that clarifies it for me. So it's not so much like the cuteness of a dog is some inherent or not inherent property. It's more like, what do you do with that property, or how does that property appear, you know, as relevant or efficacious, right? If it's not efficacious, cuteness of a dog is not efficacious in capitalism unless it can sell. So that's what, like, the property itself doesn't matter. Again, it's a propagator.
Yeah. So that goes back to the core idea. All that we're discussing is how these things appear in a social system, so that they propagate what's efficacious for that system. So the tendency is that to propagate what's efficacious for a mode A dominant system, nature, meaning non-human things that are independent from a social system, partially or totally, tend to appear as partners. They are independent because they have a life of their own. And if you treat them as having a life of their own, you'll be able to stitch them to the rest of our society better. Resources are the way that nature and all these different systems that are not social appear to us. If we're trying to propagate through them our state-like system, so if we treat them as managed, things to be managed, to be extracted. So if I meet you and you're carrying some little mineral in a bag, right? And we are in a medieval city, the chances are that if I treat it as if those things have a property, like they have some features, and those features are to be managed, extracted, stolen or protected or alienated or not, there's a higher chance we will cohere. So the fact that nature appears in that way, it will be conductive to the consistency of that world. And to do either of those two things today, it's less coherent than if you treat whatever it is. Is it waste? I'm not even sure if it's waste. Let's see if I can't sell it for scraps. Perhaps it's not waste, it's compost. Perhaps it's not compost, it is, you know, carbon credits. So these are all ways of saying the property of the systems are on hold until we see how much we can profit from them. And then we will know what counts and what doesn't count in them. And that's very much intuitionistically kind of like, because it's kind of more open subset-y, right? In the sense that, well, the moment that you start building structure around these parts, you start seeing where their limits are. But you can't just classically define this is what it is, those things it is not, right? Or you don't create a boundary that is contradictory, right? It's a third more complicated thing, which is, and the nice thing about thinking about this, which is very tragic, is to realize that part of what makes if we are right, part of what makes value so powerful, it's because most material supports are intuitionistic. Most material supports, I mean, the thesis that things in the world don't have inherent properties and that inherent properties are relative depending on context, that's a really good thesis to have in terms of how to approach physical systems, right? It resonates very well with physical reality, which is statistical, probabilistic. It is, full of margins of error and things to be exploited because there are hidden properties we didn't know and things like that. So if you compare it with the state, like the state says, this little statue is now property of whoever. Yeah, but the statue needs to be on top of a table, and the statue with time will degrade and it will lose matter. And then you need to ask, is the same statue as before? And things like this, because the world is not conducive to classical logic, right? Only some things are in it, which are kind of singular, as we were saying, like life seems to be more state-like. But many things are conductive to value in the sense of they do change and question if those properties we first saw in them are the most essential ones. They can be used for other things by changing context and so on, right? So it makes a case for why value is so scalable as a principle for social cohesion, because it's easy to store value in things compared to storing property, right? Most things, like in nature, it's hard. You say, I own the river. Like, what does that mean? Like, it's hard. Property is not that easy. You need the police, right? That's why I remember when Amelia was here and she was telling us about the amount of a country's budget that just goes on maintaining property relations the way they are, because this is not spontaneous, right? Whereas with value, the way that labor is stored in objects, meaning affordances for possible uses that can themselves create value regardless of the property that I see in them right now, right? When I sell like a plastic cup, I don't need to know what you're going to do with the plastic cup. Like the properties the plastic cup has that which are meaningful to you, I don't care. All I care is that there are some, right? And if they find new properties that I can sell them again for even more money, it would be even better, right? So it's weirdly more conductive. Mode A and mode C are more conductive to some relation with nature that is scalable than the state, which needs to have a logistical cost that is very high to keep a social world coherent. So I think that's, I mean, mode A has its own complications, but mode C clearly has this plasticity with regards to functionality and usefulness, right? It's interested in not knowing what something is useful and then just selling it, and then thank God somebody found a use for it, right? Which I think it's again, it's another way of distinguishing this, right? Raw material has this idea that it's raw, meaning it doesn't have its use, its final form, right? Whereas resource seems like something you can mobilize, right? So this is steps removed from its use, and this is closer to whatever utility can have, I think.
I'm interested in this like mode A. I haven't read Karatani, so like buyer beware. I'm just going off this, but I'm curious about this kind of mode A, mode C affinity. And I think there's a lot of people whose kind of idea of what a good political thing to do at this point would be to go back to mode A.
Yeah,
which is like not good, right? But I guess another dimension of this that I think is interesting between mode B and mode C is that, like, and maybe this entire historical development, thinking about the example of the dogs in particular, is that like part of what's happening is two kind of simultaneous things at once with the development of the dog, right? So it's like this intensification of extraction that happens. And it's also a multiplication of differences that make a difference.
mm-hmm.
In the sense that, like, okay, well, you're now finding more ways that like the material of the dog can be exploited more intensively as it goes along, because, oh, like when it goes from being like when it goes from being like a partner to like having a set function, right? You're
Mhm.
once again multiplying the things that a dog can do in some capacity, and you're finding new material in the dog, because that's the beginning of like at least some kind of idea of functional dog breeding, where you have dogs with different body plans. So like
Mhm.
the relationship to the material necessarily changes because you're looking for different things,
Yeah.
right? And then that changes once again in terms of raw material because you're no longer held by that function. You can actually
Mhm.
start looking for these emergent differences in properties
Mhm.
as you're breeding these dogs that like
Mhm.
produce more and more things. So I think this is where talking about nature in this way is really, really useful, because yeah, like your relationship to the material itself and how the logic is being applied to the material actually like changes in meaningful ways as you move through this process of development.
Yeah, I tried to do this. It has everything to do exactly with this little narrative you just proposed. I'm not sure about it. I mean, this is how we. I mean, this is even like just think of this as A is dominant, then C, then B, versus A is dominant and then B is subdominant and C is the last dominant. It's almost like chords or something, right? So this would be like some basic possibilities. And if you think of it in terms of the logical layering of this function, of these types of nature, you would have like nature as a partner is the most important, then as raw material, and only at last as a resource. And you have all these types all the way into having raw material is the most important, with being a resource, meaning a bit of potential raw material. Like we know the mines of graphite are really valuable, but it might become more valuable. So we have scientists looking for new uses of graphite so that we can even exploit it even further. And the last thing it is a symmetrical partner that we act as if it has the same depth as our social structure, and therefore it can do things, it can have agency, right? So on. So looking at this, I try to think about, okay, when you pile up these different layers, it gives different ways of relating to nature. It kind of maps very poorly to these four categories that are really interesting that this anthropologist called Philippe Descolat proposes for how different societies describe and relate to nature. What part of how is the form of activity that connects us to nature? What's the main form? And what's the basic type of technology that we're looking for or looking at this point, right? So I'm not going to go into the main the smaller distinctions, but if you look at mode A, B, and C, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. So domestication pretty much means that you're going to find ways to interact with these non-human parts. And interaction means that it needs to be kind of symmetrical. I do things and they do things back, and I learn from this, and now I act with them again in a different way. Some of these relations are stable, some are unstable, but it is pretty much a relation between two subjects, right, if you will. So it's two actors at least. That's why it's a partnership, right? So the tendency is that if you look at animism, full-on animism, the type of relation you establish with non-human beings is saying other creatures are like us, we have different uses for each other, so it's impossible to possess another creature because you need them to be actors, otherwise you undo the stitching of your own world. So if you start treating the domesticated dogs as property, no longer as actors who act on your group, it's not that you cannot do it, but it's stupid because the whole social system is built for nature to also act on us. So it will be a signal that will make no sense, right? Of course, I mean, this is very, very difficult to scale up because the more unknowns are into the picture, the harder it is to treat an unknown as a partner who's acting on you, and that you can impute some intention and that you can negotiate with. Because you just think about having really big families, you just forget the name of the people, right? And so on. Then you have totemism, which is a variation of it. I'm not going to talk about it, but then I think that, for example, the idea of thinking about mode B as a move, you're no longer interacting with an actor, but things have functions. So people have functions, like they have professions, they're bureaucrats, they play a role. If you just expand this to nature, we get the resource theory we were talking about, where you're delegating to something you dominate and manage a function that it's meant to continue, and it will continue because of its natural material dynamics, and which you pick up on the other side. That's pretty much agriculture as a model for technology, where you plant the seeds, you choose what you're planting, you create certain means for managing that, and then a certain function, which is connected to life in this case, will play out, and then you extract the result on the other side. But you're not messing with the function itself. Even if you choose the seeds, you crossbreed the plants so that they are these plants rather than those plants, at some point, there is a functional relation to that external thing, right? So you're not domesticating nature in the sense of partnering up through an interaction where you act and it acts back on you. Here is more like agriculture. We act and then we sow the consequence of our own actions, right? I put the dog to take care of the entrance of my house. He does what he does as a dog because he's a protector dog, whatever, and I extract the consequences of this, which is nobody comes in. But it's not like he's acting back, and I need to interpret the signs of the dog as a dog. The moment that I do this, I'm back at a domesticative relation, right? Interacting with that particular dog. And then this has a lot to do with what this scholar calls analogism, where you're constantly looking for functional analogies and ways of ordering creatures and understanding where they fit in this bigger structure and so on. And then you get mode C, which I think it's really good to see the difference also, not only in terms of, it's no longer a matter of function. You're not looking for matter to exert functions. You're looking for matter to be the basis for work, for energy for work. So you can decompose form to extract energy, to extract information, to extract whatever from it. And the best model for this is fuel. Like, what is the use of fuel? It makes no sense to answer that question because fuel is meant to have many, many, many uses, right? It's meant to be the way any other use is made possible, right? It's different from agriculture. So I think the dog is a nice example, but the difference between agriculture and using oil as fuel is a good distinction between raw material and resource. Resource in the sense of plants have certain functions and we're preserving that function and we're gonna kind of manage it so that we achieve our goals. It's different from breaking things apart, not respecting their form in order to extract energy so that we can then recompose things for processes that are actually the ones we care for due to other constraints, right?
So how does this map onto, so I didn't mean to cut you off, I'm sorry.
No, please.
So how does this map onto, like, you know, historically, like use value and exchange value?
Yeah, well, societies where the distinction between use and exchange value are meaningful are only mode C society. And I think that this is important because this, for me, one thing that we've tried to do a lot in our study of mode C is to show that use value is not the same as use. Use in general is any way something can be put into composition with something else for whatever purpose. It's too broad. Use value is much more specific. No wonder that it's connected to the word value. Like, it's not totally separate. It's not like there is use and there is value. Use value is the use that things can acquire in the process of producing value, right? If it's totally removed, like art doesn't have use value mostly, right? Like it's nothing you're gonna do with that object that's gonna produce further value in itself. So that idea is good to separate that. So you can have value and use value here, and you can have, so here is value is the main determining principle, and this will distinguish between value per se and use value. Here, property is the main logical concept. And then it's nice because you can distinguish this between property in the sense of alienatable possession, right? The property, private property, and property in the sense of feature, right? Property in the sense of something that an object has. It is kind of mirroring alienation and value and features and use value. And you can see the difference because features are properties of objects, and use value are not properties of objects. Our properties are relations to objects, right? And then we can do something crazy, which I have no idea how we would distinguish this in the case of gifts. But gifts do have something which they call the mana, right? Or the how, which is something like a power of binding, which has to do with the fact that if I give you a gift, now you owe me something, and through that we are actually connected. So it establishes a boundary, which is like a third thing that connects to things. And it has uses, right? Or whatever we want to call this here. I think we shouldn't use the word use so we can keep it clean, but some other word here for the qualities that it does have, right? But you can find a distinction in every mode. And you can, the nice thing is also to combine them. Because clearly, if you make this kind of, my dogs are not domesticated enough. If you make this distinction so clear cut the way we're making them, they are a bit naive. Like, of course, things are not just raw material, just resource or whatever. But definitely, like, there are cases in which this precedes this. For example, if you ask, why is it more valuable to, you know, enclose and have the monopoly of fuel over the monopoly of something else, or manage something else more carefully? You probably, by looking at value, you're going to understand how it is determining which resources are valuable and which are not, right? So things like this. Yeah, so I mean, we can go further. I'm not going to go into this because you can actually start talking about how these things are combined into these different classic notions, like of the totality. Like you have a kind of Gaia theory, which is a very interesting mix of thinking nature as a partner and as not having a form. So it becomes this kind of formless totality, which is still kind of with an agency. You can get a notion of planet, which is kind of this scientific thing, but at the same time is the place we live. So it's kind of a idea of a territory, but devoid of any type of hospitability. It's not what you're talking about when you're talking about it. It's just the lump of stuff in this rock in space, but it's kind of all the features that it has, regardless of us, right? And we have Earth, which is kind of, it's our home, so it's a matter of cutting it and finding it, treating it as a domain, but it's also kind of connected to our partner in this, which is more this kind of thing here. So you can actually get these kind of things, and you can start tracking ecological movements based on what they are privileging. And you can get why parts of the ecological movement don't go well, like the eco-modernists, who tend to talk in terms of planets, or the cosmopolitical people coming from anthropology, which are trying to reintroduce the idea of Gaia, and they kind of hate each other right now. And we can actually give account of why the social structure of their politics tends to make them see nature in this way rather than that way, right? Hopefully we can get to that. I'm bluffing a bit, but this is where I was getting at before we were talking. Yeah, so I hope it makes more sense today than it did last time. I know sorry, I'm just seeing your question, Maurice. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that there is something about the capitalist point of view which makes it harder to differentiate what we call material, which is dynamical processes that are not social but we rely on, versus just any different process that is inaccessible from our standpoint. And it's funny because if you go to that book by Descola that I was mentioning, Beyond Nature and Culture, I think it's called. I think he makes a mistake. My opinion, it's not correct, or it's kind of politically problematic to say that modern people are naturalists, which is what he calls societies in which we say that there is multiple cultures but just one nature, and everything in the world shares the same nature. So I think that's wrong, because I think I don't know anyone who really acts in that way, but I do think it's correct to say that capital sees nature in that way, and the only place where we act like naturalists is when we're working. And then there are multiple ways of working, but they're always working with the same substrate, right? Which is just the laws of physics are the only thing constraining. And that idea, which is called, he calls naturalism, I think applies very well at that point, where naturalism seems to be as if the stuff that makes a difference to us and the stuff that doesn't make a difference to us in the material support, that functional distinction is kind of lost, and it's all a big lump of uninformed stuff, right? Which I think it's a way of approaching, you know, when Frederick Jameson says that, well, capitalism is an ontological problem. I don't like that, because I think it's like too metaphysical. But I think what he's trying to say is, it's not philosophers who are suddenly concerned with being and so on. There's something social about, there's something about our social space that is evocative of looking at nature and just flattening it into whatever, being, and then we need to account for everything at once, right? Why weren't philosophers discussing being in the way we do before market capitalism in Europe? Like, why were we confronted with the issue of what is being, like, exactly first line of science of logic, being, just being without any further determination? Like, why is that a problem for that moment and not before, where, you know, you get all these different ways of discussing and dividing physics, nature, and so on? And I mean, of course there is a tradition there, but even Greek societies who also posed the problem in a similar way, they were societies that were more commerce centered than most others. So it still tracks. So I think this insight is really good. Like it fits nicely to that. So it's weird because, you know, it is a minor thing in what we've been doing thus far in the discussion about nature. But when you try to integrate it, and it doesn't take many steps, like we just need to introduce this idea of materiality and then control very carefully under which conditions immediately non-social processes get stitched into social processes. So we don't simply say the outside, everything, like it's just some things. Once you do that, the picture that you get is actually pretty comprehensive. Like, I think it's able to account for a lot of interesting things, you know. And I didn't go into this, but it's something I plan to go back in the last meeting on this thing, is that we can then add the problem of the material bases that propagate a certain social logic into political strategy, meaning we can distinguish between two very good political principles, forms or organizational forms, based on whether they can count on a material support to propagate them, or if they only work against the material supports, and therefore they're very costly to reproduce. No, this was just going back to the first thing I said, this is Lévi-Strauss's critique of some of serial music and atonal music. He said it's amazingly creative, it's genius in spirit, but it cannot count on physical properties of sound to propagate its structures. So musicians need to constantly act against sound. Sound has harmonics inside, right, that prioritize certain connections between notes rather than others, because if you play a C, you're also playing a G, is the overtones, undertones in the harmonic series. And atonal music tries to make it so that the rules for connecting notes have nothing to do with those notes. At best, they are negatively oriented to break your expectation. And Lévi-Strauss is saying, I love this, but it's not gonna last, because you cannot latch onto non-musical processes to propagate these rules. So what you get is actually 1,000 musicians creating 1,000 musical systems. You only understand those musical systems if you talk to them, because it's not like sound propagates the rules themselves. And I mean, I think that there is some conservatism in his judgment, but it's a nice intuition to bring back to politics, where often we not having access or not even being concerned with whether there are things that propagate. But you're nodding, yeah. So yeah, but there are things that propagate, you know, certain forms of organization better than others. But we don't choose between them based on the efficacy, the non-social efficacy of political stuff, right? The fact that it gets propagated in one way or another, that beyond our control. Scalability seems to be connected to that. So it's a nice thing to bring into political strategy, right? To have that concern. It's a more proactive ecological concern. So for example, between many solutions to an ecological problem, the solution that is most conducive to a political system that is interesting might be better than another that is less costly. You know, it's easier to achieve, but on the long run will be work against the production of some difference that we want to make a difference. So I think there are also interesting consequences in that direction.
I think it seems to me like on first blush, the big difference between what you're saying, like Strauss is saying also, is that like it's not a is this feasible or is it, it's not a binary, is it feasible or is it not thing. It just becomes another like layer in the dimension of the calculus, where you're actually measuring things across a number of different dimensions. And that's just one of them.
Yeah, exactly. I think that there is there are a couple of ways in which this can be added. By the next presentation, I think I'll just try to add one thing, which is, okay, we have an idea of nature and material basis. What is an environment? And it's not going to take too much work to say, well, an environment is that lump of a region of the world that you can access through the interaction of an organization with its surroundings. So it's not everything. Like I don't interact with a bunch of things. When I'm in an organized way, I interact with some things rather than others. If you change the organization, you move to a company, you then interact with other things. As a country, we interact with whatever. So the environments are relative to the point of view. Then you can distinguish between social and natural environment, because and we can see how the two things are lumped together. But then the third step, we get to what you're saying. And I think that one of the nice things is that there is this idea we toyed with, but we never managed to flesh out, which is the fact that we must be able to explain why we can make certain things intelligible only when we are organized rather than individually. Why is reasoning and intelligibility of the world different if you're part of some system rather than part of another system? And one of the things we started working on is this theory of surrogate reasoning, which is the capacity that we have, and not only us, but the possibility of displacing some complex process to some other system that can do something we can't. So for example, we are very bad at memory, but calculators are very good at remembering what they're summing up. So you can displace that calculation to the calculator. Well, you can do that to organizations. Organizations can run through processes that you cannot individually, and you can benefit from that. And we can make things clear in that way that we cannot make them clear alone. And that is another use of the material support, because depending on the material constraints of a process, it will be less costly for the process to afford us some output rather than another. So for example, if you need to work out what justice is alone with a piece of paper, the degrees of freedom you have are so big that you're probably going to say shit. If you have to actually work out together with other people who are different from you how to solve a situation, because of the constraints of that situation, you're going to get to participate on solving that problem much quicker. So the actual constraints of processes, they are conductive to certain solutions rather than others, which make the solutions almost impossible. And that is also another way that, so you don't need to think about material support only in terms of the pathways to get to a place, and in terms of will it propagate or not. There's the other dimension, which is depending on how it constrains the path, it will also make more things intelligible than other paths. So for example, this is a reason why we might prefer organizations that are more heterogeneous, because they will put us in contact with constraints that are relevant, more than organizations which are too homogeneous, meaning you only face those challenges later down the road. That also concerns the material support, perhaps not the material in the sense of a natural resource or a waterfall, right? But people, that's also under discussion. So I think that there are many ways in which this can come into strategic thinking, not only in terms of the propagation, but many parameters that we might start thinking about in terms of political organizing that could take this into consideration. I just ranted a bit about this because it's not fully developed, but this is, I think it's a different side of this whole thing, you know? But yeah, I think most people went to sleep at this point. I know it's very late for a lot of people. Morris is also, I imagine it's very late for you. Or yeah, where are you?
I'm in Chicago,
Chicago. So it's not that late, right?
so it's not that late. Yeah.
Okay.
And this is my first time here.
Well, welcome, man. So Monica and Maurice, I think it are probably much later on the clock.
Yeah, 2 o'clock.
Oh my God. Okay, guys. I think we should probably call it a day then.
Oh yeah,
Well,
thank you.
Thank you.
That was great.
wonderful.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Have a good night.
Sleep well. See you all. Bye bye.